God is greater than my failures.
God is greater than my fears.
God is greater than my questions.
God is greater than my career.
God is greater than my wallet.
God is greater than my insecurities.
God is greater than my doubts. God is greater than my pain.
God is greater than me.
Excited to be with you guys as always as we get to open up God's Word together as a little family, to be reminded of who He is and be molded and shaped more into His image together through the power of His Spirit speaking through His Word. And so I am excited to get to jump back into our series together today. I want to begin by just sharing with you a little something. So there's a New Testament professor who every year with his first year students, he has them do something of a little exercise, a little experiment, so to speak, with them. And what he does is he asks them to get out a sheet of paper and on the sheet of paper make two columns. In the left-hand column, he tells them to write all the things down that they think about when they think about God, to essentially describe God, to write down what they think characterizes Him. And then on the right-hand side of the paper, in the right-hand column, he asks them to then write down things that they think describe themselves. And they do this for a little while, and then he takes up the papers and he looks at them and he shares what he finds. And do you know what he has found virtually every time? I mean, the majority of the time, he has found that when comparing those two columns together, most of the time, 90% of what is on those two columns is identical. That those two columns match most of the time. Now, obviously, we are made in God's image, so certainly, if we were to do that experiment, there are going to be things on both lists. There are going to be things that we put down on both lists. But when I heard this, it did raise the question for me, might we, when we think about God, do we actually just envision God as though He were a little bit bigger, a little bit stronger, a little bit smarter version of ourselves? Do we at times tend to think about God when we think about God as though He were just us, but maybe a little bit better? Honestly, sometimes I ran across this quote actually this week from the French Enlightenment writer Voltaire, who allegedly said that God created man in His own image, and man has been trying to repay the favor ever since. And I thought, is that what we do? Is that actually what we do when we think about God? So we said last week that the God that we worship, the God of the Bible, right, is a God who operates on a whole other playing field than we do. That His ways are greater than our ways, that He is far greater than anything we can think or imagine, that His ways are greater than our ways, that His thoughts are higher than our thoughts, that His purity is greater than we can fathom, that He is a being of such immense power and goodness that we really can't even begin to scratch the surface on His majesty or His grandeur, that He is far greater than we could possibly, like I said, think or imagine. And we said last week that this is actually for our good, that it is for our good that God is this way, because that the fact that God is greater than we are is what makes Him a God who is so worthy to be worshiped. So we talked about how Evelyn Underhill described this when she said that a God small enough to be understood is not big enough to be worshiped. A God small enough to be understood is not a God big enough to be worshiped. And we said that what we often have the tendency to do is we want to reduce God, so to speak, that we want to kind of bring God down a little bit and make Him easy to understand and easy, honestly, for us to manage. But that is just simply not the God that we encounter when we open up the Bible. That is not the God of Scripture. And so my question for us today, though, is how can we actually know, or how do we actually know what God is like? How do we actually know what God is like? And to answer that question, we're actually going to look at a passage in the Old Testament. So last week we were in the Old Testament book of Job. We're going to be in a different book of the Old Testament. This week, we're going to be in the book of Exodus. So if you want to go ahead and grab a Bible or open up your phone or whatever it is you do, we're going to be in Exodus chapter 32 to begin with this morning. As you're flipping there or clicking there or whatever it is, let me just kind of bring you up to speed on what has been going on in Exodus up to this point in chapter 32. So essentially, Exodus is the account of God delivering His people, the Israelites, from slavery. Exodus is the account of God delivering His people from their slavery in Egypt. And so Basically, what happens is God reveals himself to this man named Moses in a really wild event where God speaks to him through a bush that's on fire but doesn't burn up. It's really wild. It's really amazing. We're going to talk about it a little bit more next week. But he comes to Moses in the burning bush and he says, Moses, you are going to represent me to Pharaoh and you are going to tell him to let my people go. And in this event, which we'll, like I said, talk a little bit more about next week, God reveals himself to Moses in a really unique way. He tells Moses his name, what we often call Yahweh, or what gets translated in your Bibles as the Lord in all caps. It's the covenant name that God gave to his covenant people. And essentially, it just means, I am who I am. That when Moses says, who shall I tell him has sent me? God responds with his name, I am who I am. And so God sends Moses and his brother Aaron to Pharaoh, and he does all kinds of miraculous things to free his people and set them on this exodus from Egypt into a place that he will give him where he will establish them as his people and he as their God. And a few chapters before this, Moses goes up on a mountain and he meets with God again, where God gives them what we now call the 10 Commandments, which are essentially God's ethical vision and design for humanity. While God winds up giving the people of Israel all kinds of laws and instructions later on, about laws and instructions about how they are to be set apart and different from the rest of the world around them. These instructions, namely, are basically like a synthesis, so to speak, of what humans need to do and be in order to flourish in the world God has made. These are his big 10, for lack of a better way of saying it. And in Exodus 32, we pick up at the tail end of Moses' time on the mountain, and quickly it reveals to us that God's vision for humanity is not actually readily shared by God's people. So that's what we're going to jump into. Exodus 32, this is verse 1. It says, when the people saw that Moses delayed to come down from the mountain, the people gathered themselves together to Aaron and said to him, up, make us gods who shall go before us. As for this Moses, the man who brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we don't know what has become of him. So you can sort of pick up on the tone here right out of the jump, right? So they don't know what has happened to Moses. For whatever reason, Moses is taking a long time on the mountain and they're like, we don't know what has happened to this guy. They're getting a little bit antsy, perhaps a little bit agitated. And so they're pushing Aaron around saying, look, we don't know what has happened to this guy who led us out of here, but you used to be his partner. Go up here, make some gods for us to lead us on further. And so that's what we find happening here in this text. Now, the reason this is important is because back in chapter 20, when God was spelling out the 10 Commandments, the first one he gives to Moses is, you shall have no other gods before me. Namely, that the highest value of our heart, the sole object of our devotion and worship, what we run to for satisfaction and contentment and meaning and purpose, is meant to be God and God alone. He is the one we are made for. And like the African church father has famously said, that we quote all the time, our hearts are restless until they find their rest in him. That he is what we are made for. Nothing and no one else is meant to take that place in our life but God and God alone. And the second commandment he gives is like it, but with some special nuance. All right, it's similar with a little bit more special detail. So this is Exodus 20:4-5. It says, you shall not make for yourself a carved image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me. All right, now at first glance, it might just sound to you like all that's being expressed here is, okay, commandment number 1, don't worship other gods. Commandment number 2, don't worship any statues of those other gods. Which might lead us to think, okay, well, that's not really going to be a problem for me because I don't have any statues of any other little gods sitting in my home. In fact, I don't have any statues, period, in my home. Check, I'm good to go, right? Not quite, all right? It's a little bit deeper than that. So commandment number 1 is about worshiping the wrong God. Commandment number 2 is dealing with worshiping the right God, but in the wrong way. Worshiping the right God, but in the wrong way. So a common practice in the ancient Near East, as well as still in many places across the globe, was to create little statues of gods called icons or images, or perhaps more directly, idols. And now these images or idols, they were not gods in and of themselves per se. They were just pieces of rock or wood or whatever they were made out of. But these idols often served as this sort of gateway between the spiritual realm and the human realm. And these images were meant to expose that this is what this God is like. This is what is chiefly important about him. This is the part of his personality that matters the most. This is what he cares about or what he's in charge of or what he controls or what have you. And so this command is violated anytime that we add something to God, some image or some attribute that goes beyond or is contrary to who he has revealed himself to be. This command is broken anytime we elevate one aspect of who God is over and above others that he has not elevated. This command is broken anytime we attempt to define God as we want him to be, rather than who he has revealed himself to be. This is why God connects this command with hating him, because essentially breaking this command is saying, God, who you are is not enough for me. Who you are as you are is not enough for me. I need you to be this way in order for me to love you and in order for you to be worthy of my praise and my worship. And God is saying, this is not how my relationship with you is supposed to work. This is not how we are intended to relate to each other. I am not something made by you according to your liking. You don't get to determine what is the most important thing about me or add something to me as though I was incomplete, or to take something away from me just because you don't like it, because I am who I am. Timothy Keller calls this creating counterfeit gods, and I just absolutely love that language, because a counterfeit is something that looks like the real thing, but is actually a knockoff, right? Like it looks like the real deal, but it's actually a fake or a fraud. It reminds me of a time that I went to, you've probably had this experience as well. It reminds me of a time I went to the bathroom at a truck stop once, and I walk in, and on the urinal is what I think is a crisp $100 bill. And I walk up to it, I'm really excited, like today is my lucky day. And I get up there and I pick it up and I realize, oh no, this is not a $100 bill. This is a gospel tract. And I was just like, Christians, you got me. Darn you, you absolutely got me. I was so disappointed. I went back to my car and I was with my wife and I was just like, you're not gonna believe what just happened to me. I'm such a sucker. But this is what a counterfeit is, right? Like from a distance, it looks like the real thing. And it might be able to trick people who aren't really looking for the real thing, but at the end of the day, it's a knockoff, it's worthless, and quite honestly, it's pretty disappointing, comparatively speaking. And this is what a carved image is. It's fake. It's a cheap imitation. It's a knockoff and worthless. It's something that can't really do what you want it to do. And that is exactly what we see the Israelites doing here. So let's pick up in verse 2. So Aaron said to them, take off the rings of gold that are in the ears of your wives, your sons, and your daughters, and bring them to me. Now, side note real quick right here, that gold that is in their ears, that jewelry, that's stuff from Egypt. That's stuff that they got from Egypt, just a matter of a few days before. After God did all of this miraculous stuff to deliver them from slavery, as sort of icing on the cake, what he did was he had all of these rich Egyptians take off their expensive jewelry and give it to the Israelites. So these pieces of jewelry were literal, tangible reminders to the Israelites of who God was to them. And yet what we see them do here is very quickly handing them over to fashion him into something else other than what he is, which I personally think is a great little illustration of how counterfeit gods are usually formed. They usually don't start out as a bad thing. They usually start out as a good thing, maybe even a God-given thing, a good part of who he is and what he does that we just simply elevate and make an idol, and thus a bad thing. But I digress. Verse 3. So all the people took off the rings of gold that were in their ears and brought them to Aaron. And he received the gold from their hand and fashioned it with a graven tool and made it a golden calf. Now, why a calf? For those of you who are familiar with the story, like why did they default to making this image of God into a calf? Like you notice they didn't even deliberate over it. Like they didn't have like a committee meeting or anything like that where they said, okay guys, what do you think we ought to make our God look like? It was almost as though Aaron intuitively just took the gold and instinctively knew exactly what to do and exactly what image to make him in. So what is so significant about this image of a calf? Well, two things. First, a God in the image of a golden calf or a bull was a very common image for a deity in the ancient Near Eastern world. The surrounding nations had images of their gods that looked just like this, including Egypt, from which they just came. In many respects, this was a culturally popular way of understanding who a deity was. And so what Israel is doing here is they're going with what they know, right? They're going with what they know, what they're familiar with, and what's around them, making their God look like everyone else's God too, making their God look like something everyone else would worship and be down with as well. They're essentially sanding away his distinctives such that they wouldn't be all that dissimilar to their neighbors, and neither would their God be to their neighbor's God. Secondly, the bull in the ancient Near East was specifically a symbol of power and strength. And if you think about the position that the Israelites are in this moment, that is exactly the type of God you could expect that they would want at this time. So remember, Moses, their leader, for whatever reason, he's delayed coming down the mountain. They have no idea what has happened to him. He might be dead for all they know, right? And so for them, if you're them, you don't know what's gonna happen to you, right? Like you're out here in the wilderness, sitting at the base of a mountain, living in tents with no country, no kingdom, no military, no land to call your own. You would likely feel lost. You would likely feel a little bit weak and powerless. You would likely feel a little exposed and in need of some sort of protection and provision of some sort. So what type of God would you want in a spot like that? You would want a God of power, and you would want a God of strength. And what would that look like in this culture? Well, it would look like a bull. And so this is the image they begin to create for their God. And notice who they say they are doing this for. Check it out. And they said, "These are your gods, O Israel," pay attention to this, "who brought you up out of the land of Egypt." These are the gods who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. When Aaron saw this, he built an altar before it, and Aaron made a proclamation and said, "Tomorrow shall be a feast to the Lord," all caps. And they rose up early the next day and offered burnt offerings and brought peace offerings, and the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. Notice what they say about this golden calf. "This is the one who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. And this shall be a feast for the Lord," in all caps, the covenant name God gave for himself to Moses. You see what they're saying? They are attributing to this image, that this is the God who saved them. They don't consider themselves to be worshiping some new God. In their minds, they haven't switched teams at all. Rather, they are shaping God into an image that they wanted and felt like they needed, an image that would have given them a sense of power and protection and belonging that they crave. And so here's what you have happening. They are deciding what God is like based upon what they want and what those around them think. A God who thinks like they do, a God who wants what they want, a God who does what they want, a God who will make them like everyone else, a God who will fulfill what they think they need and desire, essentially a God who they want him to be. So let's pause here and talk for just a moment, because admittedly, I know that very few of us are gonna go home and craft little stone images of what we think God is like, right? Like some of us might be into pottery or whatever, but very few of us are probably sitting at our wheel doing our pottery and saying, "Hey, look, this is my God. Look what I made," right? Like very, very few of us are gonna go down that rabbit hole. But just because we aren't melting down jewelry doesn't mean we make counterfeit gods any less. Just because it may not be something physical doesn't mean we don't create counterfeit gods any less. In fact, I might be willing to argue that there may be no command that we break more routinely than this one. And perhaps we don't even realize that we do it. J.D. Greear calls this Build-A-Bear and Burger King theology, all right? Where we assemble a deity that suits us the best. Where when it comes to God, we can have him our way, right? So Thomas Jefferson he's a great example of this. Thomas Jefferson is famous for a lot of things, but one specifically is this right here. Thomas Jefferson literally cut things out of the Bible to essentially form and shape his own. And this is real. Like you can go check it out in the Smithsonian. It's called the Jefferson Bible. You see, Jefferson was a deist. He was not a Christian. So in his worldview, anything miraculous was impossible. So he was very interested in Jesus' ethical and moral teachings, but he rejected anything that even smelled miraculous or supernatural, including his resurrection. So what he did was he recreated God in a way that made sense to him and fit his previous worldview. He reshaped God to make him more palatable for where he was already coming from. It was a deity, but it was a deity on his terms. Now, if Thomas Jefferson really isn't your speed and that feels a little bit unrelatable, maybe just think back to the words of that erudite theologian, Cal Naughton Jr. from Talladega Nights, who famously said, "I like to picture Jesus in a tuxedo t-shirt because it says like, I want to be formal, but I also want to party. And I like my Jesus to party because I like to party," right? And here's the thing. That sounds silly and we laugh about it, but the reason it's so humorous is because it scratches on something that we kind of know to be true, that we kind of do this too. And our God may not be wearing a tuxedo t-shirt, but we dress him up how we like him just the same. So for example, we like to see ourselves as good people, right? Like we like to see ourselves as good people. So we will craft a God that affirms that in us. We will create an image of God that tells us, yes, you are in fact a good person. So sometimes this will look like creating a God who hates what we hate, or even hates who we hate, who gets really angry at the sin struggles of others while overlooking our own. Or perhaps we'll craft a God who really doesn't care all that much about sin, because if he doesn't care about sin, then I don't really have to care about sin either. It's a counterfeit. It's a knockoff. It's a fake. Or perhaps we want the approval of the world around us, like we want to be really accepted in our society. So we'll shift God into something he's not so that it seems like, hey, we can all get along. So we'll make him more of a gentle creature, right? One who doesn't tell you that what you're doing is wrong or that anything about you needs to change. And it will turn him into a being that only exists to affirm us and make us feel good about ourselves, where we're going and what we're doing with our lives. So we'll tone down aspects of his character like his righteousness and his holiness, and we'll emphasize other parts of his character like his love so that we don't ruffle any feathers. Or worse, so we don't get thought of or treated any differently at work or in social situations. It's a counterfeit. It's a fake God. It's a knockoff. Or maybe we believe that the key to happiness is possession and comfort and wealth. So we create an image of God who is indifferent to what we do with our money. And we'll say things like, well, what God really cares about is my heart. And my heart loves him. He doesn't really care what I do with my wallet, even though Jesus makes it plainly clear that what you do with your wallet indicates what's going on in your heart. Or perhaps we'll create a God who promises to give us wealth, to give us these things if we're faithful to him. This is the God of prosperity theology, and it's a counterfeit, it's a fake, it's a fraud. Or similarly, maybe we just want the good life, however we define it. It doesn't necessarily have to be wealth. Maybe it's just a life free from burden and suffering and stress and things like that. So what we do is we create an image of God whose primary purpose is to essentially give us the good life, to bless our life and keep us safe. This is a very common counterfeit that some are calling moralistic therapeutic deism. And it's an image of God that believes that God's primary job is to meet my needs and give me the good life. He primarily exists to serve me. And as long as I do my part, he's going to deliver on that. Or we want unchallenged sexual and romantic freedom so that we can do whatever we want as long as it doesn't hurt anyone, or at least anyone that we don't want to hurt. So we invent a God who doesn't care about what we do with our bodies or with our relationships, but only cares about love. It's a counterfeit. It's a fake. It's a fraud. Like, listen, I know so many people who really want to be out of their marriage because they think they found someone better. They think they found someone who more completes them or whatever it may be. So they invent a God who is cool with divorce. And listen, that's not to negate the times in which Scripture says that divorce is a viable option, and there are some. But a lot of people aren't concerned with what the Bible actually says. They just want a God who will justify what they've already decided to do. But these are counterfeits. They're fakes. They're frauds. They might look like God in some ways from a distance, but they aren't the real thing. They are idols just built by our imagination, and we may not even realize that we're doing it. Because in a lot of respects, this is just what everybody does. It's how everybody views God, and we will readily find people who will affirm that vision of God in us. And listen, hear me. I'm not just saying that this is your problem, okay? I'm saying that this is all of our problem, mine too. Like, we are all prone to create these false images of God in our minds. Like, in my life, I've done this in a number of ways. Like, I so easily believe that God is a God to where if I'm faithful, he's gonna hold up his end of the bargain. That as long as I'm faithful, he'll make my life and everything in it go well. So if I'm a faithful pastor, if I do my job well, then my church will always be healthy and everyone here will always respect me, right? Like, I'm tempted to believe that. Or that if I'm faithful to do the right things with my family, that God is a God who will give me well-behaved and well-adjusted kids and a marriage that is conflict-free. I believe that. My counterfeit version of God often shapes him into something of a vending machine, to where if I just put in the right currency, he gives me what I want. But the reality of it is those aren't things that he has ever promised to do. It's a counterfeit. And sure, God is a God who blesses his people, but that doesn't mean that he always gives me the outcomes that I want. And listen, I found for me in those times, what can happen is I start to speak and act like God has somehow failed me, that God has failed. But he hasn't failed me, just some false idea of him has. And my experience has been that this is what happens to a lot of us. In fact, it's why I see many, many people walk away from the church and walk away from God altogether, because they think they are leaving a God who wasn't holding up his end of the bargain. But in reality, the truth is that they just weren't really worshiping him to begin with, but some knockoff version of who they thought he was. They didn't come to the God of the Bible, but to some counterfeit version, a God of romance or a God of prosperity or a God of conservatism or progressivism or whatever. And he was made up. He was completely made up. And hear me, maybe that is something that some of you need to hear this morning, that maybe you need to hear directly today. Like, in your heart of hearts, you feel as though God has failed you. But what if you've assumed some things about him that he actually hasn't said about himself? What if what has failed you is the false mental image of God that you concocted in your mind? And that failure is actually a gracious thing to you because it paves the way for you to actually meet the real thing. Perhaps a really great way to tell perhaps a really great way to tell if this is you would be to ask yourself, listen, how often does your God contradict you, confuse you, or make you mad? How often does your God contradict you, confuse you, or make you mad? Because if your God is just kind of always cool with what you do and there's never any friction or never any need for you to change, chances are you're not really letting God be God. You're only reimagining him as you want him to be. In the words of German theologian Karl Barth, he said that if our God never contradicts us or makes us mad, then we're likely not worshiping him, but a reflection of ourselves. And here's the thing. Creating a counterfeit God will always go bad for you. It will always go bad for you. It never winds up taking you where you think it's going to go. Check out what happens in verse 6. Go back to that one. It says, and they rose up early the next day and offered burnt offerings and brought peace offerings. And the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. Now that word play there is a really interesting word in Hebrew. It's the Hebrew word, and I'm probably going to mispronounce this. I think it's sakah or something like that. And it was a Hebrew idiom that, honestly, it carried some sexual connotation to it. And so basically, here's what's going on. So basically, they make an image of God into a big golden cow, and they begin worshiping in front of it, offering sacrifices to it, trying to evoke God's favor for him to come down and inhabit the image as a part of their ritual. And naturally, what's going on here is thousands of them start getting drunk, and then, you know. And I bring that up just to show you how quickly everything devolved for them, how quickly things went completely off the rails for them. Just how quickly their worship of a counterfeit led to their own corruption. Because this is what counterfeits do. Counterfeits corrupt us. Counterfeits distort the real God, which in turn distorts us. It distorts the real God, which in turn distorts us. A distorted view of God always leads to a distorted life. The Israelites tried to reduce God down to a single attribute that they were familiar with, but God can't be reduced down to just one thing about him. His majesty is found in the totality and the harmony of all of his attributes. But if you focus on one, even your favorite one, you will grow in a distorted way. I think it's really interesting how Moses responds later on in the chapter when he sees what's going on. He comes down off of the mountain and he gets really angry at what he sees happening. And so what he does is he takes the golden calf and he burns it, and then he grinds it into a powder and puts it in the water for the people to drink, which seems a little extreme, to be fair, but this is what he does. And inevitably what happens is it makes the people of Israel sick. And that is such a great picture of what counterfeits do, because it's true. They make us sick. They corrupt our inside, right? They corrupt our soul. They make us sick towards God. So for example, if your counterfeit God is a God who is full of justice, right? Namely for people who are different than you, but not compassionate, what's gonna happen to you? Who is the type of person you are going to become if that's the type of God that you worship? You will likely become someone who is mean and judgmental, perhaps very religious, but likely very self-righteous, right? On the flip side, if your counterfeit God is all love and grace, but not righteous and holy, what type of person are you going to become? What will you be formed into? You'll become a person, honestly, who just goes along with whatever the world says is okay. You won't see sin as that big of a deal. You might see it as unwise or inconvenient or whatever, but you won't see it as the cancer destroying the world and the people that God made. You may even wind up calling things acceptable that God calls evil, and calling the things that God calls acceptable evil and oppressive. If your God is not sovereignly powerful, what type of person are you going to become? You'll likely be a person who lives in constant worry or fear or panic, and you won't bother becoming a person who prays, because what's the point? It's not like God can do anything about it anyway. If your God is a judge but not a redeeming father, you'll wind up being a person who's obsessed with your failures, who constantly critiques yourself, who lives with this sort of constant nagging sense of God's condemnation over you. You might also become a person who's constantly trying to prove yourself, constantly trying to prove that you're better, that you're not as bad as you feel yourself to be on the inside, never able to rest in his pleasure over you. If your God is just a ruler and not an all-satisfying being, then you will live a life that is full of discontentment, right? You'll live a life that's full of discontentment. You'll become a person who's envious of what others have, unhappy with the life you've got, and constantly wishing you had something else, because your God is a God who's holding out on you. If your God is all about money, you'll be materialistic, and your peace will rise and fall with the number of zeros in your bank account. If your God is all about romance, then you'll be desperate for attention, depressed when you're not in a relationship, and or dissatisfied with whatever marriage or relationship you find yourself in. It's sickness. It's distortion. It corrupts us. It's like Augustine elsewhere has said, that stress, worry, anxiety, strife, jealousy, and dissatisfaction are simply smoke rising from the altars that we have erected to our false gods. His point is that if we look at what lies at the heart of the majority of our spiritual problems in this life, what we will likely find is the worship of a counterfeit God. What we will likely find is that we have created a God who is not the God of the Bible. And if I can just throw this in here for you, I think it would be very worth your while this week to investigate the areas of your struggle, whatever they are, to ask yourself, what does this tell me about the God that I worship? What does this tell me that I think God is really like? Am I wrought with anxiety? Well, what does that tell me? Does it tell me I'm worshiping a counterfeit God who's not in control? Am I content with my sin? What does it tell me? Am I worshiping a God who is indifferent towards what is right and good? Am I discontent? What does that tell me? Am I worshiping a counterfeit God who I believe is supposed to give me everything that I want, or a counterfeit God who is unloving and I think is holding out on me? What does it tell me? And I don't know what it may be for you. It could be any number of things. But look at it and ask, what does this tell me? And the reason I invite you to do that is because the reality of it is that real healthy spiritual growth comes from seeing and knowing the real God and all of him, not just a part or a portion of who he is. And so how do we know what the real God is like? How do we not get deceived and not create false pictures of God in our minds whom we worship and serve? How do we come to know the real God? And the answer is actually really simple. we get to know what God is really like through the person of Jesus. Through Jesus, through God in flesh. Listen to the words of Colossians 1:15. It says, he is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. Notice that word that's used there. He is the image of the invisible God. Jesus is the image of God. In Exodus, God said, you will not make any images of me. Instead, God, out of his love and grace towards us, says, instead, if you really want to know who I am, I'm going to show you. If you really want to know what I am like, let me show you the image of myself, and his name is Jesus. We have something that the Israelites did not have. We have Jesus, the very image of the invisible God in flesh. We don't have to guess and try to figure out what God is like. What would he do? What would he say? What he would think? We have that. Jesus puts that on full display for us. Essentially, Jesus is the genuine image of the real God. He is what God looks like. In Jesus, we see the beautiful mosaic of every part of who God is. We see him with all power to heal the lame and give sight to the blind. And we see him clothed in vulnerability, born into frail flesh in a manger. We see him possess all wisdom and knowledge as he meets with people who are curious and seeking about him. He meets with those in need like Nicodemus and Zacchaeus and the woman at the well. And we see his graciousness and compassion to listen to them and respond to them in their searching. We see him confront sin and show compassion to the sinner. We see him showing forgiveness and mercy towards those caught in transgression and call them to repentance at the same time. We see Jesus filled with gentleness towards the weak and the poor, the destitute and the broken, and the very same Jesus who is filled with righteous anger towards those who defile the temple and misrepresent God. We see Jesus with his disciples on the Mount of Transfiguration, shining with all the brilliance and glory of his full godness on display. And just a few chapters later, we see Jesus on the Mount of Crucifixion and all his humility and glory, dying on the cross for our sin. In fact, if you really want to see Jesus, you have to look no further than Good Friday and Easter to see who God is and what God is really like. Because on the cross, we see a God who is loving and a God who is holy. We see a God who hates sin and a God who goes to great lengths to save you from it. We see a God who loves you where you are and a God who loves you enough to call you towards something greater, a God who allowed himself to be crushed for your sin and a God who stands in victory over it. He is the Lion of Judah. He is the Lamb that was slain. He is, in the words of the scriptures, the great I am. And here's the point. God will not be put into our boxes. He will not be put into our boxes. He will not be sanded down into an idol to be manipulated by those he made for their own devices to suit their own purposes. That's not who he is. And when you receive him and follow him in all his fullness and glory, here's what happens. You actually become more like him. You get more formed into the image he actually made you to be. You get to step more fully into what true human flourishing actually looks like. His image begins to radiate off of you. The truth is that you become what you worship. And when you worship Jesus, you become like Jesus. You become more and more made into the image of God who made you. And he begins to remake you to look more like him, where the peace of God, the joy of God, the love of God, the patience of God, the holiness of God, that all of that becomes a part of you as you reject counterfeit images of him and embrace the real thing. And that's really all I have for you today, is I just want you to know that this is the God we worship. His name is Jesus. And you don't have to sit here and wonder what God might be like. And you don't have to sit here and allow your imagination and your desires or the world around you try to tell you what God is like. You have what you need in Jesus. Jesus shows it to you all in and through his word. This is the God we worship. This is who we are called to believe, to close the gap between who we think God is and who he really is. We're called to be a people who know that God is greater than the little false images that we create of him. And that is truthfully the best thing for us. And that's what I want for us. I want for us to be a Jesus people who aren't tossed and turned by every whim and desire or any crafty scheme of man that would try to tell us this is what God is really like or whatever, but that we would be a people who are rooted and grounded in that in Jesus is God. And he is where we are headed. He is the object of our worship. He's the only image that we need. Let me pray for you.